Good evening. I have asked for this radio and television time tonight for the purpose of announcing that we today have concluded an agreement to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia.
In 1973, the announcement by then American President Richard Nixon was resolute. The war was on its way to an end, although it was a slow process. Only on April 30th, 1975, did North Vietnamese tanks roam the streets of Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. The machines roared through the center and carried out an imposing parade of the People's Army. It was the victory they had been eagerly awaiting since the beginning of U.S. operations in the region. The war had claimed the lives of 2 million Asians and nearly 60,000 Americans. This, not to mention the enormous political and economic cost that had fallen on Washington. American society was divided and distrusted its leaders after 10 years of futile fighting. It's not surprising. The scars of that conflict shaped not only Uncle Sam's politics, but also those of China and Russia for decades. This leaves us with a very important question. What would have happened if the war in Vietnam had a different outcome? In this new installment of military history, we propose a game of suppositions to see how different the 20th and 21st centuries would be if Washington had triumphed in Southeast Asia. We assure you that the world would be a very different place. First, we must make a fundamental clarification about the nature of that victory. The conflict in Vietnam long predates the involvement of the United States. The fighting dates back to the years following World War II, when the country declared its independence from Japan and France. After that independence revolution, a period of internal wars began, pitting the communists, aligned in the north, against the non-communists, located in the south. In the early 1960s, Washington became directly involved to prevent the spread of socialism on the continent. In any case, in the hypothetical scenario we're considering, the victory would actually belong to South Vietnam, a country that would surely become an ally and subject of the United States. Now let's delve into some fundamental details to imagine a different outcome.
You were with him when he was hit. What happened?
He just dropped. We didn't even know where the rounds came from at first. And we saw a gook standing about 10 feet away and we got him.
Surely you are familiar with harsh images like the ones we've just seen. The archive of what happened in Southeast Asia is enormous. The Vietnam War was the first military conflict to be televised practically on a daily basis. The American public received live footage through news broadcasts, which was a shock compared to other past conflicts. Family dinners were flooded with the heat of the jungle and the smell of bodies burned by napalm. The notion of death and human cost was never more present. This spurred strong protests against the American presence in the region. For the first time in its history, a large part of the population disagreed with the military's activities. It was a serious legitimacy problem that intensified as the conflict progressed. But although this was a constant phenomenon, it is possible to mark the exact point at which public opinion turned its back on the intervention in Vietnam. Until 1968, the news reaching the United States was violent and brutal, but it spoke of an overwhelming victory and support from local civilians. Everything changed with the Tet Offensive, a massive attempt by North Vietnam to hit the invader. It consisted of a series of surprise attacks supported by both the efforts of the guerrillas and the cooperation of peasants. Although the Tet action was a resounding failure for the Viet Cong materially, it was an important victory symbolically. In the United States, it became more than clear that the war was far from being resolved. Also, that on the other side, there was an enemy in inferior conditions, but never willing to give up. Finally, that the support of many of the civilians was with the Viet Cong. The Asians did not want the United States' presence, which raised a question for all Americans. If they don't want us there and we are not winning, why do we keep sending young people to die? Of course, there were answers to that question, and they were all related to the global balance of power. The goal was not to hand over Asia to communism, but that was too far away for the general population.
I believe that one of the reasons for the deep division about Vietnam is that many Americans have lost confidence in what their government has told them about our policy. The American people cannot and should not be asked to support a policy which involves the overriding issues of war and peace unless they know the truth about that policy.
For a complete conquest of South Vietnam by the United States, the government needed total support from the citizens. That's why, when imagining an alternative past, it's crucial to propose a more aggressive strategy prior to the Tet Offensive in 1968. Let's suppose that between 1966 and 1967, American forces accelerate their efforts, resulting in a victory over the North Vietnamese and the near-complete destruction of their territory. However, this presents a complication, as the actual campaign revealed that bombings and napalm were not enough to defeat North Vietnam. The guerrillas constantly changed routes, eluding the enemy's powerful war machinery. To win, the United States must carry out a massive invasion to seize control of strategic points like Hanoi and other cities. In doing so, it has to dangerously traverse close to China, something that could trigger a much more brutal war. For the sake of our supposition game, let's propose that the tide of war changes abruptly and the airstrikes finally force the hand of the communist fighters. If Kong were defeated, the country would reunify under Southern domination, with Saigon becoming the capital and all pre-existing communist institutions destroyed. This administration would be heavily influenced by the United States, not only administratively but also economically and culturally. In short, this hypothetical Vietnam becomes a satellite of Washington in the heart of Asia, much like how, post-World War II, Japan serves as an enclave of NATO in the Pacific. But there's a small geographic detail. As we anticipated, China lies on the northern border of the country. It's hard to imagine that the Red Dragon would sit idly by while Uncle Sam plants his flag in its backyard. In the worst-case scenario, the Chinese People's Government would act similarly to how it did during the Korean War in the early 1950s, when it collaborated with the northern side to repel the initial American waves. In this case, it's likely they would directly support the few remaining guerrillas and insurgent cells still standing in Vietnam. But another factor must be taken into account. The 1960s are a much more tense and dangerous time than the 1950s. The Cold War is in full swing, and what is at stake is not just territory but something more precious: global political hegemony. If we consider an even more negative and pessimistic scenario, it wouldn't be surprising for the Soviet Union and China to join forces to confront the West. This could escalate into a new world war, the most violent one yet. It's a terrifying outcome that warrants its own speculation video. Let's move to the other end of the spectrum, to the best possible case for Washington. Now let's suppose that China and the Soviet Union are not keen on shedding the blood of their people, and instead choose peaceful coexistence, accepting the outcome of the war. In that case, socialist nations are likely to support the weakened Viet Cong, but in a more covert manner, without sending troops or large amounts of military equipment. Despite the situation not escalating into a war between powers, the strengthening of the guerrillas perpetuates Vietnam as an ungovernable nation, with constant battles and attacks. It's possible that the country cannot sustain itself as a democracy for long on its own. The United States will have to intervene with money and military presence to completely pacify the area. However, the popularity of communism in the rural areas of the North and South, as well as the population's hatred towards the invading nations, will seriously complicate this task. Washington will face a situation similar to what it experienced in Afghanistan, where they planted their flag for 20 years trying to convince a people who rejected them. At this point, it's necessary to remember that for the Vietnamese, communism was not just a different economic and social vision, but they saw it as an anti-colonialist tool. Their primary goal was not to teach the Communist Manifesto in schools, but to liberate themselves from the yoke of invading powers, whether France or the United States. That sentiment doesn't extinguish easily. At this point, there are two possible outcomes. Economic hemorrhaging and financial crises in the 1970s lead to the United States withdrawing prematurely from Vietnam before achieving a stable and peaceful government. It's only a matter of time before the reorganized and waiting communists regain power. In the other possible universe, the American government intensifies its spending and completely eliminates the local guerrillas, finally destroying the Ho Chi Minh Trail, that strategically important route for the Viet Cong. For the sake of our game, let's suppose this second maneuver is employed. Firstly, this avoids the economic crises and embargo that Vietnam suffered during the 1970s in our timeline. In this hypothetical world, famines, loss of plantations, and social tension generated by the country's isolation by NATO are avoided. Instead, American entrepreneurs see Southeast Asia as an interesting destination for their investments and pour money massively, creating a thriving industry. In a few years, the devastated country transforms into a constantly growing area, as happened in Japan and South Korea. Don't worry, later on we'll delve into the differences between these cases. 5. Over 300,000 South Vietnamese were sent to re-education centers controlled by North Vietnam, with the aim of turning them into functional members of communist society. In those places, they were beaten, tortured, and, in some cases, killed. Let's hear the words of a survivor from those facilities.
In 1973, when the Americans withdrew from Vietnam, we were in the battlefield. We already felt abandoned by our ally. We already felt that we didn't have enough artillery to fight the war. We didn't have enough supply. We didn't have the support of the American government anymore. So when we got captured and sent to prison, that validated our feeling about being betrayed.
In the unified country of our hypothesis, such activities would not take place, although it would be naive of us to assume that Viet Cong soldiers would be treated kindly by the American army. On the other hand, the economic growth we previously described prevents millions of people from leaving the country for other destinations in search of opportunities. That's why there is never a massive immigration of families from Southeast Asia to the United States, which completely changes the country's demographic configuration during the late 20th century. Another significant positive effect of the American victory is that acts of violence committed by other regimes in the region might not occur, as the presence of a NATO member would be a significant deterrent. Some historians dare to assert that if an American victory had occurred, the Cambodian genocide carried out by the Khmer Rouge regime might never have happened. The men of Pol Pot would not have had the freedom to eliminate 1.8 million people if, just a few kilometers from their borders, there were U.S. military bases. Ending the war before 1968 implies avoiding a series of painful events triggered by the devastation left behind by Uncle Sam, as well as by embargoes and the destruction of regional economies. This was a breeding ground for violent regimes that perpetrated inhuman acts against the most vulnerable populations. The hypothetical victory of the United States in Vietnam also implies a change in international politics. A positive outcome would likely prompt the nation to intervene directly to prevent the spread of communism. Washington took part, at least indirectly, in virtually every armed conflict in the second half of the 20th century. However, this emboldenment leads to direct actions against countries like Cuba and Islamic leaders in the Middle East. This more aggressive policy leads to the United States becoming involved in more armed conflicts, significantly worsening the tense relationship with the communist bloc of China and the Soviet Union. As perfect rivals, everything the United States does ultimately affects Moscow's decisions, and vice versa. A more aggressive and assertive Washington also implies much more decisive Soviet policies. Let's consider the Russian interventions in the Middle East in the late 1970s and early 1980s. In a world where American soldiers emerged victorious in Southeast Asia, there is no conceivable way that Russia would accept a defeat in Afghanistan. In that case, their support would have been limitless until achieving the victory of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan over the Mujahideen, the Islamic fundamentalist fighters. This affects the history of the last 30 years in unexpected ways. Without a jihadist government in Afghanistan, the Middle East is no longer the terrorism cauldron that leads to the rise of the Taliban and the Islamic State. This doesn't mean that this threat doesn't exist, but it will take very different forms. Who knows? Perhaps the attacks against Uncle Sam might never have occurred. On the contrary, Russia would have become a much more desirable target for Islamist insurgents. Instead of the Twin Towers crumbling, we might have images of the Kremlin in flames. It's clear that Vietnam was a showdown. On one side, the communist Viet Cong supported by China and the Soviet Union. On the other, the Southern Front with assistance from France, the United States, and its allies. That struggle between the West and the East, capitalism versus communism and so on, would have intensified significantly in the event of an American victory. But there are also social details that affected the way the powers acted during the 20th century. As we anticipated, the Tet Offensive and the chaotic operations that followed sparked a strong anti-war movement in the late 1960s. But would this stance have been successful if the United States had managed to win before 1968? Probably not. It's clear that there will always be critical voices, but not an organized and massive group protesting in Washington daily for the end of the war. Those demonstrations were a symbol of the time and set the tone for public opinion regarding foreign interventions. An American victory implies a radical change in the social climate of the 1970s, which in our timeline had a strong presence of progressive figures. Instead, military success could advance the conservative policies adopted by Reagan in the 1980s by a decade. It's like a domino effect. Each piece ends up affecting the next, so the echoes of that social change would be strongly felt in the present. While it's tempting to take Korea as an example, with its territorial division and marked differences in social and industrial development between North and South, Vietnam is a very different case. Firstly, the separation of the territory into two parts was never part of the plans of either side. Reunification was a primary goal and could never have been effectively carried out as in Korea. Additionally, the communist government in the North has policies very dissimilar to its North Korean counterpart, being somewhat less personalized and placing a strong emphasis on the role of the peasant in social functioning. This hypothetical analysis serves not only to imagine alternative worlds, but to understand the importance of the conflict in Vietnam when thinking about the second half of the 20th century. It was not only a defeat for the United States, but it implies the triumph of an economic model, rivalry between powers, the change of international strategies, and the beginning of new progressive movements. With the blood of the millions of fallen in Southeast Asia, several of the pages of modern history were written. Before saying goodbye, we would like to include you in this universe of assumptions. What do you think would have happened in the event of an American victory? Leave us your answer in the comments box. In this way, we reach the end of the video. If you liked this content and want more hypothetical exercises, we invite you to subscribe and activate notifications to be aware of our news. Without further ado, we say goodbye until the next installment of Military History. Thank you for joining us.